Hi everyone, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us for the webinar this morning. My name is Shannon Moreno, and I am the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Specialist, otherwise known as CLC Specialist with Texas System of Care, and I also work with the Health and Human Services Commission. This morning, we are going to be taking a look at the ABCs of CLC, or in other words, just some very basic terminology that may be commonly found in different cultural competence trainings. Oftentimes in these different trainings, terminology and vocabulary may have just a real quick review with like a Webster's definition type of a thing that for folks who are not familiar with these terms may kind of keep up with, but may find it kind of difficult to apply some of the terminology in the rest of the training that gets kind of into the meat and the potatoes of how to apply that. So again, the purpose of this webinar is to provide some further clarification on common terms and phrases. This is intended for review prior to attending other CLC opportunities through Texas System of Care specifically, but hopefully this information will also be beneficial in attending future trainings and opportunities in regards to cultural and linguistic competence, regardless of who is hosting that training. Some uses of this information this morning is to either learn for the first time or review, if some of this is a review for you, current terminology that is kind of considered best practice in the field. We also hope that this information will inspire deeper learning. Again, the focus this morning is clarification on terms and phrases. It is not going to automatically lead to providing support and services to communities, to youth and families in a way that is genuinely culturally and linguistically competent. So please, don't view this as kind of like a checklist. Oh, I did this training, now I'm culturally competent. That is really not very realistic for any one-time training, but then particularly for this webinar, it is again foundational information and an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper in vocabulary that oftentimes kind of just gets skirted over and not explored to a deeper level. Also use this webinar to raise red flags of current knowledge or even lack thereof. If there are words or phrases that are not familiar, or if after this webinar, there's still need for further clarification on what is the difference between this term and that term, or I'm not really quite sure I understood that, please reach out to me. My contact information will be at the end of this webinar. I would love to provide further resources or further explanation. And then also hopefully, again, it will inspire that deeper learning, to engage in some other opportunities to take this information further. Now, before we start digging into the actual terminology, it is necessary to do a little bit of a disclaimer as far as the limitations of this information and then just the reality that language changes. And that's not only in regards to vocabulary specific to cultural and linguistic competence, but just in general, languages change over time. And there is a need for flexibility with that. There is a need for a desire to stay on top of what current terms are going to be best, so that when agencies are putting out materials, outreach materials, for example, or providers are engaging with youth and families, that the language that's being used is not a barrier, and just respecting the dignity of every person and terms that they would prefer to have in use. Sometimes in regards to language changing over time, there are words or phrases that at one time were considered appropriate, but then over time, they're now considered derogatory or offensive, right? Other times it's not that extreme of a change. Sometimes words or phrases are considered appropriate and kind of the best way to phrase things or word things. And then over time, there's a realization that that's not necessarily an offensive way of speaking. It's not necessarily taboo, oh, don't say that, but it's no longer what we might consider as best practice. And of course, in every aspect, we want to make sure that we are providing best practice and engaging with our local communities. it's also important to understand that there is, in regards to language changing over time, going to be a difference between the rate of change and the responsiveness to that need to change between larger institutions, activist groups, and then how individuals and families and communities prefer to identify themselves. You may go to different trainings that are hosted by, again, activist groups or, kind of smaller groups that don't have as much bureaucratic red tape to keep up with the terminology. And, hear kind of terms that may be a little bit newer that you haven't heard before. Just because larger institutions are not yet utilizing those terms doesn't discredit the need to be aware of that terminology. And just because, maybe perhaps you work at an institution that is not currently using the most recent, kind of most reflective of the community at this point in time terminology, that doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be an understanding of those terms that are out there. And above all else, if an individual or family says that they want to identify a certain way or they prefer certain terms, that needs to be respected, right? We don't want to get to a place of, well, here, this is the way that we say things, or I went to this, training and the new way of saying things is this. If someone is saying, I prefer to identify this way or be referred to using certain words, then that is above all else very, very important. So let's start actually digging into the terms. Today, the format is going to be a focus on this versus that. We are not going to cover every single vocabulary word out there that relates to CLC in one way or another. CLC, again, being cultural and linguistic competence. We're just going to scratch the surface a little bit here. So the theme this morning is this versus that and some common terms. First of all, we're going to take a look at actually the difference between cultural competence and cultural responsiveness. And this is an example of something I was just talking about, where sometimes the change of language over time just shows that there is a new kind of best practice way of framing things. It's not necessarily that the older way of saying something is automatically taboo and offensive and, oh, geez, I can't keep up anymore. I can't ever, I can't keep up with what I can't say anymore type of a thing. So let's take a look, first of all, at cultural competence. Cultural competence is basically the idea of providers in a variety of different settings or professionals in a variety of different settings being able to engage with individuals from different cultures than their own in a way that is culturally competent or even culturally proficient. This model follows, as you can see, a continuum that does have an end. Oftentimes the model is visually represented in kind of like a staircase representation, kind of like you can see in the slide here from SAMHSA. Critiques of this framework is that there is an end. And the reality is that when we're talking about cultural competence, or whichever wording you want to use to represent that concept or that idea, the reality is that you never do get to a point of, I have arrived and now I'm culturally competent and I no longer need to, learn about my the folks that I'm working with at an individual basis, because I know, cultural differences and what that's going to look like and how to interact with others. So again, this is not a taboo phrase. This is by and large what is definitely used across the board in many different institutions. But some other terms that you're going to hear include cultural responsiveness, which again, these terms are trying to get at the same idea, but cultural responsiveness takes a little bit of a different lens to it, and it kind of provides a little bit of a different framework. You can see that this model is circular, and it goes through 4 stages: seeing things in a new way, understanding, realization, and reflection. And that just keeps going on and on and on. Now, even in regards to cultural competence, if you were to take a look at those specific stages, the higher up stages, cultural competence and cultural proficiency, the explanation of those stages do kind of have this idea reflected in there of, if you are culturally competent, if you are culturally proficient, you're going to have this understanding that you need to continue to learn. But this cultural responsiveness framework just in a nutshell kind of explains that concept a little bit better than it does. Another term that you may start to hear a little bit more is cultural humility, which is the idea, again, that we should never think of ourselves as having arrived, but always have an attitude and a perspective of humility. The individual is the expert on their culture, on their self-identity, and we need to have a very humble attitude and be open to learning more about the person. The next this and that difference that we're going to go through is prejudice versus discrimination. So again, these are two words that get used a lot, and I think that a lot of people maybe do understand the difference between these two, but the main difference between prejudice and actual discrimination is prejudice is mostly dealing with thoughts towards others. Okay, so it is thoughts that is lumping people into a group, typically in a very negative way, and making assumptions about a person because they appear to be a member of a particular group. Okay, so a person may have a prejudice. For an example, a male employer may have prejudice ideas that women in the workplace cannot perform at the same level as men in the workplace. As long as those ideas are in the person's head, those are considered a prejudice. Once it moves on to actual action based on that prejudice, that's where we see discrimination. That's where we see, with the example that I give, if that employer, that male employer, then because of his prejudice viewpoints, does not promote women specifically because they are women, just as an example, then that's an example of a discriminatory act. And that's really kind of the defining difference. It is very, very difficult to have prejudices and never have that in any way whatsoever turn into discrimination. Really, the only way that that might happen is if the person who holds prejudice doesn't have opportunity to act on those prejudices for discrimination. So discrimination also requires a level of a power imbalance. If the same exact person who I was talking about is kind of bottom rung in an organization, he can think all day that women in the workplace cannot perform, but he's not going to have the power to enact that discrimination. Okay, so that is really the big difference there. Is it's thoughts versus actions, and typically, there's some exceptions to this, but typically discrimination is also going to require a difference of power for a person to actually enact that discrimination. It's also important to note here, and this idea will be brought up later with a couple of other things, that discrimination is not always dependent on whether or not the motivations of the person was malicious. Okay, so just because someone doesn't have this like evil conspiracy and out to get everyone type of a framework, just because they would never wish violence on someone, discrimination is not always violence. It can include that, absolutely, and that's great and wonderful if someone is not for violence against others. But that alone does not mean that someone's not capable of displaying discriminatory behavior, or that an institution at large is not capable of displaying discriminatory behavior. If policies and procedures are set up in such a way that certain groups are kept out of accessing services, that is discrimination. Even if no one within that institution at any point in time set out to make that happen, or if the setting out to make that happen, you know, is in years bygone, long time ago, and currently is not necessarily an issue, discrimination may still be taking place. Next, we're going to work through the difference between disproportionality and disparity. This is something that you'll hear a lot of times in regards to looking at data. And in different cultural competence trainings, we talk about disproportionality and disparity quite a bit, but if your position is not such that you are specifically looking at data yourself or working with data, it may be a little bit confusing to begin with. So when looking at disproportionality, you really are specifically looking at one population and how it is either overrepresented or underrepresented within a certain environment. And that environment could be education, that could be within a certain career or profession, that could be within a neighborhood, that could be within child welfare or juvenile justice. It's, again, just very, very basic blanket terms, looking at proportions of one population within a specific environment. So using this little visual representation that we have here of apples, let's just say, for the case of this example, that 50% of the apples in the world are the green ones that you see, and 50% of the apples in the world are the red ones that you see here. Given those numbers and the demographics of that population of apples, we can see that there is an underrepresentation of red apples here. So we're just talking about red apples compared to the 50% of the world's population of apples. In this picture, there's only one red apple presented. Now we can also see an overrepresentation of the green apples. 50% of the apples in the world are green. In this picture, green apples are being overrepresented. That is a disproportionality. As opposed to a disparity where you're actually comparing typically outcomes of two different populations to the other. So you have one green apple, you have one red apple. You can see that the green apple has some positive outcomes as far as we can tell. It looks pretty healthy, looks good to eat. The red apple, however, has different outcomes. That's a disparity. These two populations have some different situations that are going on right now. Now, the existence of a disproportionality, the existence of a disparity, in and of itself does not explain why that is going on, right? Just by taking this observation that the green apple looks nice and healthy, the red apple looks rotten, just that alone, we don't have an explanation. Maybe the red apple is older. Maybe the red apple came from a tree that was poisoned. Maybe the red apple, once it fell from the tree, went through some really bad conditions, and the green apple had some products put on it that, were able to sustain that green apple for longer. The numbers alone don't answer that question. We use the data. We use the existence of the disproportionalities. We use the existence of those disparities to then look at a broader picture, look at history, look at environmental factors, and try to start to answer the question of why does this exist and what can we do to change that if that's a negative thing. Okay. Next, we have the difference between stereotype and generalization. And I think that this is something that people may be more or less familiar with, but then in practice, when we actually hear examples of stereotypes or we actually hear examples of generalizations, it can be kind of easy to confuse these things as well. So first of all, a stereotype. Some characteristics of a stereotype are that stereotypes tend to be very rigid thoughts. This is the way that these folks act. This is the way that the world functions. Very rigid, tend to also be based on kind of anecdotal information. Well, I know this one person who, or I grew up in this one town where, and based on just kind of life experiences, which are nothing as far as information goes, but that is opposed to generalizations, which it was really hard, I'm going to be honest, to find a picture that, kind of portrayed generalizations very well. Pictures, if anything, tend to be stereotypical. So you have a little tongue-in-cheek quote from Mark Twain there for that one. So sorry, that was a tough one to find. But generalizations are, just like the word sounds, more general terms that are actually based on either research or a common consensus from a particular group with whom the generalization is describing, right? So a generalization is something where If you said to, 100 different members of that population off the street who are part of that group, is this generally true for your population? Not necessarily true for you as an individual, but generally true for your population. They would say yes. So an example of a generalization is that in the Latino culture, family is incredibly important. That in general tends to be true and tends to be descriptive. That has been shown through plenty of sociological research. That is something that is espoused to be true by members of that community. But that generalization becomes a stereotype when every time you come across a Latino person, you assume that their family is incredibly important to them and that they would want their family to be involved in all of their treatment planning and decisions and so on and so forth. It's, taking some of this information to extremes of I have some of this information and I'm going to be very, very rigid in my thoughts about it. And again, you can see in the image some examples of stereotypes here. Generalizations, again, going back to that, are very, very beneficial when talking about cross-cultural communication, things that if you are of a different culture than a youth or a family that you're engaging with, kind of, perking up your ears, listening up for different things that could very well be representative of their culture in general and turn out to be true for them as well. Sometimes things that are generally true for their culture is not going to turn out to be true for them. So that's where we really need to walk a fine line between generalizations and stereotypes. The next concepts we're going to be talking about is the difference between equality and equity. Equality and equity, these terms are talked about a lot in regards to kind of higher level, how an organization may be structured or resources may be managed, the actual policies and procedures within an organization. But it's also an important concept for folks who are having direct contacts with communities to have as well. So, and again, this is one of those things where we're not saying that equity is the word and equality is bad, taboo, no one says equality anymore. No. But they are different concepts, okay? So equality was an incredibly important concept, continues to be an incredibly important concept. Back when in the history of our country, it was not a given that all people have equal value as human beings. That was not always an accepted concept with our country, led to certain laws, led to certain restrictions that hopefully we're all at least a little familiar with some of that history there. And so equal rights movements, for example, again, we're not saying here that equality is a bad word, we're just clarifying the difference between equality and equity. Equal rights movement, really shook things up in regards to that and made the proclamation, yes, all of these different, categories of people all have equal value, all have equal worth, all have equal rights, and so equality is still very, very much an important concept to understand. Something that's a little different, however, is the concept of equity. Equity is making sure that individuals, families, communities are getting what they need in order to fulfill their full potential in accordance with their rights. So if it is decided within our society that we want, for example, mental health treatment to be readily available for all children and families that need it, equality services will be just kind of a blanket cookie cutter, everyone gets the same thing. Equity says we need to look at, specific needs amongst specific populations, and that may require doing things a little bit differently. I also want to make clear, sometimes when folks see this image, they automatically think that those boxes represent money, and it seems unfair to like take money away from one population and put it over to another population or something like that. Those boxes represent a vast array of resources, including time, including policies and procedures that allow for everyone in the local community to access resources. They can represent money, but they can also just represent a different way of doing things to make sure that all folks are getting served, not just those who maybe were in mind at the foundations of some of our institutions. The next thing we're going to go through, which oftentimes can be very confusing, is the difference between race and ethnicity. If this is the first time that you're hearing, explicitly the difference between these two, or maybe you have heard it a couple times, but it's just kind of, difficult to really understand the difference. First of all, let me say there's good reason for that in some aspect, which we'll be talking about in a moment, that these are constructs that are kind of, I will get to that in a moment, second thought. But I do want to say, if after this explanation of race and ethnicity, you would like some more resources, Google Race the Power of an Illusion is a great website that has some interactive tools that you can work through to kind of understand a little bit further the difference between race and ethnicity, specifically the history of race and its constructs, and also has some great videos to explain this further. So race, what is race? Race is basically a categorization of human beings based solely on physical appearances. Racial science was really big beginning in like the 1800s, where scientists would look at a lot of different physical characteristics of folks across the world, and different scientists had different categorizations that they would use to kind of clump folks together. This was really regardless of what country you were from, what language you spoke, what religion you follow, what tribe you belong to. It was 100% on your actual physical characteristics. And different scientists categorize people differently. And so some scientists would have categorizations that included maybe 15 different categories. Others maybe had 3 or 4 main categories that they felt the entire world population could fall under. It is now understood with advances in science that there is not actually a biological basis for race. It was literally scientists of the time taking a look at physical characteristics and making groupings. And a lot of times, even within a particular group, to be honest, some folks don't look that a whole lot like each other. But at some point, scientists kind of had to, draw the line, or they didn't have to. They did draw the line of where people were placed. It also captured our current constructs of race, captured the physical appearance of individuals at that point in time. Humans have been migrating across the world, intermarrying throughout the generations, since the beginning of humankind. And so sometimes this does get convoluted and kind of funky because our current physical presentations of descendants of the folks that these scientists, hundreds of years ago at this point, studied and analyzed, may have changed, maybe not. So that's why sometimes this can get a little difficult to categorize. But again, it's based completely on physical characteristics. Another area where there's sometimes confusion is that race, the categories of race have been used, throughout the history of the last couple hundred years to justify a lot of atrocities, as well as justify laws in order to, keep slavery in place, in order to justify colonization throughout the world. And so one example of this, what I'm talking about, is the one drop law that you may recall way back in school, where in the early years of the United States, if someone had even one drop of blood from a descendant of Africa, an African American, they too were considered African American, regardless of how they physically appeared. Okay, and so again, there's there's a history of reasons why this goofy construct that doesn't have any biological basis in its beginnings and has been utilized for political reasons throughout the years. If it seems funky today, it's because it's been funky since its inception. However, even though race doesn't exist, you may hear from time to time, we're all part of the human race. That's absolutely true. But the consequences of the construct having been created and perpetuated throughout time does create racial inequities and some institutional issues that we're going to continue to talk about today. So I hope that made sense in regards to race. Again, if it seems funky and kind of hard to follow, and sometimes you think, why is this person, this race? That's because it is a very funky thing. That is opposed to ethnicity. So race, again, purely physical characteristics. That's why I chose these pictures, just showing the skulls, and all you can see, you don't know anything about these people in the photographs other than some of their physical characteristics. Ethnicity is more about how individuals identify with a particular group, okay? So within ethnicity, things that can kind of affect someone's ethnicity is typically there's going to be some ancestry factor. Typically there's going to be some nationality factor, but nationality and ethnicity also is not exactly the same thing. This is the group of people that folks identify. So like I was talking about back when racial science was really, taking it off, scientists who would travel to Africa, for example, and take observations and group different people different ways were just looking at physical characteristics to group them in a particular race. They were not looking at, for example, the tribes that individuals may align to. That is more where someone is going to identify their own personal ethnicity. An example of this is, someone who is of the Hmong population. Their race will be Asian American. Their ethnicity is Hmong. Let's say there's someone who lives in Puerto Rico. They are Black. Their ancestors were slaves who came over from Africa to Puerto Rico, and they have since immigrated up into the United States. Their race is going to be Black. Their ethnicity is going to be Hispanic or Latino, okay? Another example, a Caucasian person who's been living in the United States, their family has been here for a couple generations, immigrated from Ireland. Their race is going to be white or Caucasian. Their ethnicity is going to be Irish American, okay? And again, this is something that, can vary. You can't necessarily just assume or guess someone's ethnicity. You really have to get to know them because they may identify in a particular way, focusing on a particular aspect of their ancestry that is stronger than others. They may not consider their ethnicity to necessarily be their nationality, or they may very well. Okay. The next topic that oftentimes can kind of be kind of confusing for folks who haven't had a lot of interaction with the LGBTQ+ community is the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. And I think a part of that may even be the term itself, LGBTQ+, because within that there are some acronyms that stand for different sexual orientations, such as lesbian, such as gay, as well as different aspects of gender identity, such as transgender. Those are not the same thing at all. So first of all, sexual orientation is all about who a person is sexually attracted to, romantically attracted to, in relation to their own gender identity, okay? So here on the visual is an example with some kind of visual like traffic signs to show a few different types. These are definitely not all of the sexual orientations that exist, but a few of the different types of sexual orientations. These have nothing to do with how feminine or how masculine an individual may identify. It has nothing to do with how someone may express their gender. Not the same thing. Oftentimes, I shouldn't say oftentimes, sometimes we may think of a lot of stereotypes with this community when we think lesbian, for example. We may get a certain image in our head about that. Those don't match up whatsoever. How someone expresses themselves, their gender identity, you know, their personal style, their likes and their dislikes. And another myth in regards to sexual orientation is sexual drive has nothing to do with your sexual orientation, okay? If you are bisexual or you are heterosexual, that has no correspondence, cause effect, anything in regards to that as to how you present yourself, what your gender identity may be, if your current gender identity is the same as the gender you were assigned at birth, has nothing to do with that. Sexual orientation is purely about who you are attracted to. As opposed to that, gender identity deals with your gender and also has nothing to do with sexual orientation. It's a completely different part of who you are as a person. So gender identity is how someone identifies. And we tend to think of this in terms of a very binary construct. You are either male or you are female. And if someone is transgender, they flip-flopped. Well, for some folks, that is the case, but other folks are along a continuum of what masculinity or femininity is and how they want to express that. There is also folks who identify as being gender queer, gender fluid, which is, you know, sometimes the individual may identify more towards masculinity, sometimes more towards femininity. There's not just this binary, okay? So gender identity is the way that the person actually identifies. I am a woman, I am a man, I am gender fluid, however that may be for that individual. Gender expression, just like it sounds, is the actual expression of that gender identity. Some folks have a very strong gender identity that they do not express. Oftentimes reasons for that is because they fear discrimination or even violence. And so gender expression is the actual either oftentimes femininity or masculinity or gender neutral expression that someone decides to follow. Sex assigned at birth, that's fairly self-explanatory. It's the sex that you were assigned at birth. If I was about to say if you were born, when you were born, you know, the doctor said you were either male or female, or possibly intersex. We all have a sex that we were assigned at birth. Some of us, throughout our lives continue to identify and express that same gender. That's called cisgender. And then some folks, they do not identify that way or express that way. And then again, going back to the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation, there's who you're physically attracted to as well as potentially who you're emotionally attracted to, which are also considered two different things. And then our last terms that we're going to go through this morning before we open it up to answering some questions is the difference between individualisms and institutionalisms. And I want to make clear the way that it's written on the slide is individualisms, not individualism. So I just wanted to point that out there. Now, these terms can also be used in the construct of equity or inequity. Sometimes you'll hear things, for example, like racial inequities. That's also getting at the idea of these different isms. I put down here isms to be a little more inclusive. That can include ageism, that can include sexism, that can include a variety of different ways that prejudice and discrimination may be displayed. So individualism is what tends to come to mind when most folks say any type of ism, whatever that ism may be. And what tends to come to mind is, a person, sometimes even a group of people, just basically being a jerk or even being violent. This is things like racial slurs. This is things like, again, violence against someone just because they are a member of a particular group. And so a lot of times we may think that there is no need for further inspection of ourselves or inspection of our workplaces or inspection of our workplaces, policies and procedures or whatever that may be, because we don't say those words. We treat people well. I and my coworkers, and we're always very nice to everyone. We're not going to treat someone in a mean way just because they have an accent or are racial or ethnic minority or this, that, and the other thing. That is focusing on these individualisms. And that's good. And that's great. And that's necessary. And definitely these acts are still unfortunately present today. And we do need to make sure that we do have good responses when such individualisms take place within institutions and within our society. But there's a difference between an individualism and an institutionalism. Institutionalisms, again, like this idea was kind of brought up a little bit earlier before, exist even if everyone within a particular institution would never in a million years say a racial slur, or would never in a million years, not promote a woman because she's a woman, or would never in a million years not accept a client because they identify as LGBTQ+. Institutionalisms are ingrained into institutions, sometimes due to a very dark past of proficient personal isms just being integrated within that system or within that institution, and sometimes simply because those policies and procedures, hours of operation, methods for outreach within the local community were created by a very homogenous group that kind of are the experts on what will work for people who are similar to them. What that can lead to is institutionalisms where, sorry, Susie, you are of a different demographic makeup than were the folks who started off and maybe even continued to lead our institution. So we just didn't have you in mind, and it's going to be a lot of work to rework things to make sure that we're serving you correctly, okay? Of course, no one says those things, but that is sometimes what happens. We also have very malicious histories of institutionalisms that the ramifications are still unfortunately felt today. The cartoon image here is describing a situation of redlining where, banks and lenders would not give loans to African Americans in certain communities. And they literally created maps, and the federal government also had a part in this, created maps that literally had red lines where essentially African Americans were allowed to live. This included African American GIs who went to World War II, came back, could not utilize the benefits of their GI bills, and included Latino GIs who went to World War II, came back, and also experienced similar redlining issues. That's a huge institutionalism. And even though anti-discriminatory housing practice laws have been passed, when damage has been done, it's not hard to see some of the ramifications of that. And that is just one example of an institutionalism where we can very much see the effects of those types of situations having a perpetual lasting effect. And so it's really the responsibility of agencies, of systems, to take a hard look at the history of their own policies and procedures, the history of laws that maybe they didn't control at the time and now are, in years bygone, and take a look at, is that continuing to have an effect on our local community? It's important to look at data of the population of your local community versus, folks who are being served, and see, is there a disproportionality here? Is there a disparity here? And if so, then that is something that we really, really need to investigate and take a look at. What are successful ways that we can overcome that? So again, thank you so much for joining in. Here's just a little review of all the different terms that we went through. I know it was quite a bit. Hopefully I didn't talk too quickly, but I do want to open it up to some questions. Specifically, first and foremost, if there were any terms that I went over that we need some more clarification on, and I can, try to give some better examples or what have you. Well, it doesn't look like any questions are coming through, so there is my email. If you did want to maybe have like a one-on-one conversation about anything that was mentioned today, would like some more information, some further resources, please contact me. I'm absolutely here to utilize at your disposal for any further information. And again, if you have any feedback, if this presentation was helpful and you would like to hear more terms defined and clarified, or specific populations discussed or anything along those lines, please also feel free to contact me about that.